Think about the last time someone told you that you were wrong, not gently, not with concern, but with that particular kind of certainty that only comes from people who have already decided what your future looks like. The kind of certainty that doesn't ask questions because it doesn't believe your answers matter. Most people, when they hear that fold, they change their plans, they shrink, they do what everyone else is doing because doing something different feels too dangerous when the whole community is watching and the whole community has already made up its mind. But every now and then, maybe once in a generation, someone doesn't fold. Someone keeps going, and what happens next changes everything we thought we knew about who survives and who doesn't when the world turns brutal. This is the story of Winifred Moorfield, a widow, a farmer, a mother of two small girls, a woman who built something underground with her own hands in the autumn of 1886 without asking anyone's permission, and whose decision by the time February arrived would be the only reason 31 people were still breathing. But before we begin at the beginning, let me show you where this story ends. February 1887. A correspondent from the Huron Daily Plainsman rode his horse across 12 miles of frozen prairie to reach a farmstead east of town. The snow was still 3 feet deep in the open fields. The temperature had not risen above zero in 6 days. He had heard a rumor in town about a widow and a hole in the ground and a number that didn't make sense, and he had come to see for himself. What he found was a thin woman standing beside a low mound of earth in the middle of a white field. She was 29 years old. Her hands were rough and cracked and brown from work. A thin line of smoke rose from a small metal pipe that poked through the snow-covered mound like a finger pointing at the sky. There was nothing else. No barn, no visible structure. Just the mound, the smoke, the woman, and the silence of a world that had tried very hard to kill everyone in it for the past 5 weeks. The correspondent asked her the question he had ridden 12 miles to ask. "Are you the one who kept 31 people alive in this thing?" Winifred Moorfield looked at him. She did not smile. She did not boast. She nodded once the way a person nods when the answer is so obvious that the question barely deserves the effort. He wrote in his notebook in handwriting that was shaking slightly from the cold, "Does not look like a hero, looks like someone who already knew." He was right about the second part, but the knowing had not come easy, and it had not come without cost. 9 months earlier, spring of 1886, the Dakota Territory was not a place that forgave mistakes. It was a place that had been settled on borrowed faith by men and women who moved west carrying little more than a trunk, a Bible, and the belief that hard work would eventually be enough. The land did not care about that belief. The land was flat and enormous and windswept in ways that no description printed in an Eastern newspaper had ever prepared anyone for. The sky in summer was beautiful enough to make a person stop working and just stand there looking up. But the sky in winter was something else entirely. It was the kind of sky that made experienced farmers check their firewood 3 times a day and pray quietly before going to sleep because they knew what cold could do out here, far from any city, far from any help, where the nearest doctor was 40 miles south, and the roads disappeared under a drift in less than 2 hours. Winifred Moorfield had arrived in the territory in 1879 at the age of 22, with her husband Lawson, a Norwegian-born carpenter, who had convinced her that the freeland grants were not too good to be true. For 7 years, they had worked 160 acres of short grass prairie 12 miles east of the town of Huron. They had built a frame house, sunk a well-planted winter wheat, and raised 2 daughters, Astrid, who was 8, and Corinne, who was 5. It had been hard. Everything out here was hard. But they were surviving, and surviving in the Dakota Territory was not a small thing. It was the whole thing. Then in the spring of 1886, Lawson Moorfield caught pneumonia. Day one he coughed but still walked out to fix the fence posts along the north boundary. He told Winifred it was just a cold and she believed him because she needed to believe him because the alternative was something she could not afford to look at directly. Not yet, not with planting season 2 weeks away and the fence still broken and the well pump making that sound again. Day four, Lawson did not get out of bed. Winifred boiled water, soaked rags, pressed them hot against his chest, changed them when they cooled, boiled more water, pressed again. Astrid stood in the doorway of the bedroom and watched. She did not come in. She did not speak. She stood there the way children stand when they know something is wrong but do not yet have the language to name it. Corinne tugged at Winifred's skirt and asked, "Is Papa sleeping?" Winifred said, "Papa is resting." Day seven, Winifred kept the girls out of the bedroom because Lawson's breathing had changed. It no longer sounded like breathing. It sounded like a man trying to pull air through water, each inhale a slow, wet rattle that filled the small room and made the walls feel closer. Winifred sat beside the bed and held his hand and for the first time allowed herself to think the word if. If the doctor were not 40 miles away, if the roads were not a river of mud from the spring thaw, if she were not sitting in the middle of a grassland so vast and empty that the nearest real help was a distance that might as well have been the ocean. Day 11, silence. The breathing stopped sometime before dawn, and Winifred sat beside the bed for a long while before she stood up and walked to the kitchen and told her daughters that their father was gone. She dug the grave herself. The neighbors would have helped. Anson Yardley had offered twice before she cut him off, but Winifred picked up the spade and walked to the spot east of the house where the ground was soft enough to work, and she dug. It took most of a day. The soil was heavy from spring rain and stuck to the blade in thick clumps, and she had to scrape it clean every few strokes. She dug 4 feet down, then 5, working past the point where her shoulders locked and her lower back seized and her grip on the handle went numb. She did not stop until the hole was deep enough and square enough and clean enough to satisfy something inside her that she could not explain, some need to do this one thing right because so many other things had gone wrong. She washed Lawson's body herself too. She heated water and carried it to the bedroom in the big copper pot, and she washed him with the same care he had used when he washed his tools at the end of a workday, thorough and respectful, because the body was the last tool he had used, and it deserved to be put away properly. She dressed him in his good shirt, the one he wore to church, the one with the collar she had mended twice. His hands, when she folded them across his chest, were still rough with calluses, and she held them in her own for a long time, comparing them as fingers thick and square from years of carpentry, hers thinner but already hardening from the same land that had shaped his. The funeral was held on a Thursday. The neighbors came. They brought food. Anson Yardley from the next section west brought salt pork. Lottie Calloway brought bread. Pastor Abner Underhill, who served the small German Lutheran congregation 4 miles north, read from Scripture with his hat in his hands and his voice steady and kind. The widow Mabel Stratton, who lived alone on 40 acres to the south and who had buried her own husband 3 winters ago, held Winifred for a long time without saying a word. It was the only embrace that day that Winifred felt was real because Mabel knew. Mabel knew that there were no right words, so she did not try to find any. Astrid did not cry at the funeral. She held a small brass boat nail that Lawson had given her months ago, some scrap from a project meaningless to anyone else, and she squeezed it in her fist so hard that when Winifred finally opened the girl's hand that night, the nail had left a perfect red imprint in her palm. Corinne asked, "Did Papa hurt?" And Winifred said no, And that was the first lie Winifred told her daughters after Lawson died, and she would remember it because she did not know the answer, and not knowing felt worse than any truth would have. The kind words lasted about 2 weeks. Then they began to change shape. It was subtle at first. No one said directly that Winifred Moorfield should give up. They said adjacent things. Anson Yardley mentioned that he knew a man in Huron who could help arrange a fair price for the equipment and livestock. Pastor Underhill asked gently whether Winifred had considered the circuit pastor's offer to help arrange passage to her sister-in-law's home in Wisconsin. Lottie Calloway brought another loaf of bread and said while setting it on the table that Wisconsin was beautiful in the summer, her cousin had been there, the children would love it. Every suggestion was delivered with warmth. Every suggestion pointed in the same direction away from the farm, away from the land, away from the life Winifred and Lawson had built together over 7 years of work that had nearly broken both of them. And the suggestions were not irrational. Winifred knew the arithmetic as well as anyone. She owed $37 on the plow. She had $22 in cash. 160 acres of Dakota prairie required at minimum 2 strong adults to operate at any kind of margin. And planting season was already passing, and there was no hired labor available because every farmer in the territory needed every hand for their own land. The numbers told a clear and simple story. A woman alone with 2 small children on 160 acres heading into what every old-timer in the county could feel in their bones was going to be a hard winter. That story did not end well. And then 3 weeks after the funeral, a man named Prentice Whitmore came to her door. Whitmore was a land speculator from Huron. About 45 years old, clean-shaven, wearing a vest over a pressed shirt in the middle of a prairie where most men wore the same trousers 3 days running. He was the kind of man who knew the dollar value of everything and the human value of very little, though he was careful never to show the second part openly. He brought paperwork. He had already done the calculations because men like Whitmore always had. He offered $320 for the full 160 acres, including assumption of the $37 debt on the plow. He laid the offer on Winifred's kitchen table, and he walked her through it with a pencil, patient and precise. 320 minus 37 was 283. Enough for 3 train tickets to Wisconsin, enough for 6 months of modest living, while she found her footing, enough for a future that did not involve standing alone in a frozen field in January. Winter out here doesn't wait for anyone. Mrs. Moorfield, Whitmore said. He said it the way a man says something he has said many times before to many widows in many kitchens. Winifred looked at the paper on the table. She picked it up. Her hands trembled slightly, and the trembling surprised her because she had not trembled while digging Lawson's grave, or while cleaning his body for burial, or while standing in front of the neighbors accepting their condolences. But now, holding this piece of paper, she felt her hands shake because this was the easiest thing she could do. $283, train tickets, Wisconsin, safety. The numbers made sense. The logic was clean. Everything about this offer was reasonable. And that was exactly what made it so dangerous, because Winifred Moorfield knew that reasonable was not the same as right. She set the paper down. "I'm not ready, Mr. Whitmore. Not no, not never, just not ready." Because the truth in that moment was that she did not know yet. She did not know what she was going to do. She only knew that she was not going to decide today in this kitchen with this man's pencil marks still warm on the table. Whitmore nodded. He left a business card beside the offer. "I'll come back before October," he said. "The price may be different." He meant lower. They both knew it. That night, after the girls were asleep, Winifred lay in bed and stared at the ceiling that Lawson had framed with their own hands 7 years ago. The boards were tight, The joints were clean. He had been a good carpenter, a careful man, the kind of man who measured twice, not because he had been told to, but because it was simply the right way to do things. Winifred reached up and ran her fingers along the nearest joint, smooth, precise. Lawson. She was not thinking about Whitmore. She was thinking about cold. Last winter, even with Lawson, even with two adults feeding the stove in shifts, the temperature inside this frame house had dropped to 28 degrees on the worst night. Lawson had gotten up at 3 in the morning to split more wood and feed the fire, and by dawn the house had climbed back to 40, which was survivable, but not safe, not for children, not for weeks on end. And that had been a normal winter. Everyone said this one would be worse. This winter, there would be no one to get up at 3 in the morning. There would be only Winifred. And then not like a decision, more like a door swinging open in a room she had forgotten existed. Winifred thought of Dagny. Dagny Chenoweth, her grandmother, born in 1821 in a valley in western Norway, in a place where the mountains came down to the water, and the winters lasted 7 months, and the wind off the fjord could strip the warmth from a stone house in an hour. Dagny had spent the first 30 years of her life in a structure built partially into the hillside above that fjord, a house made of stone and sod and earth, a house that did not fight the cold because it did not need to. It lived inside the ground, and the ground kept it alive. Dagny came to America in 1851, settled on a farm in Minnesota, and never forgot. She never forgot what the earth could do. And in the summers of Winifred's childhood, when the family visited the old woman's farm, Dagny had talked. She talked the way old people talk when they know that what they carry will die with them, if they don't find someone willing to listen. She sat in the farmyard in the long summer evenings and drew pictures on the back of flour sacks with a carpenter's pencil diagrams of tunnels and drainage angles and stove placements. And she explained in a mix of Norwegian and English what it meant to build with the hill instead of on top of it. Here is what Dagny taught. At a depth of 6 feet below the surface, the ground temperature in the northern plains of North America stays between 45 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. Not because of fire, not because of magic, because the earth absorbs solar energy slowly across the warmer months, stores it in the mass of the soil, and releases it steadily during the cold months. The ground at 6 feet does not freeze the way the surface freezes. It is stable. It is not warm by any comfortable standard, but it is the difference between life and death when the air above it drops to 40 below. And Dagny understood more than the principle. She understood the application. How to read a slope for drainage so water would not pool against the walls. How to orient an entrance to the southeast to block the prevailing northwest winter wind and catch the low morning sun of December and January, which would send horizontal light directly into the doorway and add a small but real measure of passive warmth. How to build a short entrance tunnel that functioned as an airlock, letting cold air warm partially before it reached the main chamber. How to use a small iron stove in an underground space to create a temperature not merely survivable but genuinely warm, because the thermal mass of the surrounding earth acted as a heat battery, absorbing warmth from the stove and releasing it back slowly so that a fire that would last 4 hours in an above-ground frame house might effectively heat an underground chamber for 12. How to lay a stone floor that served double duty, preventing moisture from wicking up through the soil and providing additional thermal mass that held heat even more efficiently than packed earth. How to run a stovepipe at a slight angle through the sod roof so that every inch of pipe passing through insulated material was an inch that kept its heat inside the room instead of losing it to the sky. Dagny called it building with the hill. She had drawn it on scraps of burlap with a carpenter's pencil while the summer light faded over the Minnesota fields, and she had spoken with the patience and urgency of a woman who knew that no one else was listening. But Winifred had listened. She had listened carefully the way children listen when they can feel without understanding why that the person speaking is giving them something that will not be offered again. Now lying in bed in a frame house in the Dakota Territory 17 years later, Winifred remembered. She remembered the diagrams. She remembered the angles. She remembered Dagny's hands, brown and thick-knuckled drawing lines on burlap with absolute certainty. But remembering was not the same as knowing. And Winifred was not Dagny. Dagny had built into an actual hillside in Norway with generations of knowledge behind her. Winifred had a slight natural rise in the ground 40 yards north of the house, a rise of no more than 3.5 feet over 20 yards. Barely noticeable, barely anything. Was it enough? Would the drainage work? Would the angles hold? Would any of it function the way Dagny described? Or had Winifred spent 17 years carrying a memory that was beautiful but useless, a sketch on burlap that had no power in the real world? She did not know, and not knowing with 2 daughters sleeping in the next room was terrifying. But she knew one other thing. $283 would last perhaps a year in Wisconsin. Then what? Charity from a sister-in-law she had met twice, domestic work in a strange town. Her daughters growing up without land, without roots, without the thing that Lawson had believed in enough to cross an ocean for. Winifred did not sleep that night. In the morning, she walked out to the slight rise north of the house and stood on it. She felt the ground under her boots, solid, cool even in the August heat. She thought, if Dagny was wrong, I will lose everything. If Dagny was right, I will keep everything. And then she thought something else, something quieter and more honest. I don't have a better option. Whitmore's $283 is not a future. It is a delay. This land is the only thing I own that cannot be spent. She went back to the house. She fed the girls breakfast. She washed the dishes. And then she found Lawson's measuring stick, the one he had brought from Norway, hand-carved with hash marks he had cut himself, and she carried it out to the rise and began to measure. 22 feet by 14 feet. She drove stakes at the corners and ran twine between them. The rectangle sat on the slight rise exactly where drainage would carry water away from the walls rather than toward them. She picked up the spade. The prairie sod of the Dakota Territory was unlike anything in an eastern garden. It was a dense interlock mat of root and grass and clay that had been building itself for thousands of years. Each square foot weighed between 12 and 16 pounds and required sustained force to cut. Winifred drove the spade down and felt the resistance immediately, the ground pushing back, not hostile but indifferent, the way the earth always is, neither helping nor hindering, simply being what it is. She cut the first block, 18 inches long, 10 inches wide, heavy, dense, real. She set it to the side and cut another. She worked from first light until her daughters came home from the schoolhouse 2 miles up the road, and then she worked for another hour while they did their lessons at the kitchen table, and then she stopped, made supper, read to the girls, and slept. Day 2, day 3. Her hands blistered on the first day, the blisters burst on the third, and by the end of the first week they had hardened into calluses that would not fully soften for years. She wrapped rags around her palms and kept cutting. Each day the hole grew deeper. Each day the walls of earth rose around her. She learned to read the soil as she dug the dark, crumbly topsoil, giving way to the reddish-brown clay beneath, heavy and sticky on the spade, and below that the paler, denser subsoil, harder to cut, but more stable, the kind of earth that holds its shape and does not crumble. On the 10th day, Astrid began coming home from school early without explanation. One afternoon, Winifred looked up from the bottom of the excavation and saw her daughter standing at the edge looking down. 8 years old, serious Lawson's eyes. "Are you building a new house?" Astrid asked. "I'm building a safe place," Winifred said. Astrid nodded. Then she climbed down into the hole and began picking stones out of the exposed earth and carrying them up to the surface. No one asked her to. No one told her to. She simply saw work that needed doing and did it. From that day on, Astrid helped every afternoon after school. Not much, but steady. And Winifred, watching her daughter's small hands pulling rocks from the clay, felt something shift inside her chest that she could not name, something between gratitude and grief, because the girl should not have had to do this. But she was doing it, and she was doing it without complaint. And that was Lawson in her, that quiet willingness to show up and work. Day 19. The excavation was finished. 5.5 feet deep, which put the floor just below the frost line for that latitude. 18 feet by 12 feet of floor space after allowing for the wall thickness she planned. 216 square feet of underground living space. Winifred stood at the bottom of the hole she had dug with her own hands over 19 days and looked up. Above her was a rectangle of sky blue and enormous, framed by walls of raw earth that smelled like rain and iron and time. She placed her palm flat against the wall. Cool, stable, silent. The earth did not vibrate. The earth did not shift. It simply held. For the first time since Lawson died, Winifred felt something that was not grief and not fear. It was quieter than either of those and steadier. It was the beginning of a belief she was not yet ready to fully trust, the sense that her grandmother might have been right, that the ground was not empty, that it was holding something, had always been holding something, and all she had to do was build a way to reach it. She did not call it certainty. She called it maybe. And maybe after 3 months of nothing but loss and doubt and the weight of other people's pity was enough to keep going. That night, Winifred went back to the frame house, washed her hands, and saw Whitmore's business card still sitting on the kitchen table where he had left it 7 weeks ago. She picked it up, turned it over in her fingers, and placed it in the drawer beneath the bread box. She did not throw it away. She was not ready to burn that bridge, not yet, not until the structure was finished and the first frost had proved what the earth could do. But she did not look at the card again. Outside, the autumn wind moved through the tall grass, making a sound like something breathing. Somewhere in Huron, 12 miles to the west, Prentice Whitmore sat at a desk in a rented office above the general store and wrote a letter to a business associate in Sioux Falls. The letter was brief and confident. The Moorfield parcel, 160 acres east of Huron, will be available before Christmas. The widow is holding on, but she will not last. Expect the price to come down. I will handle it. He sealed the letter, posted it, and did not think about Winifred Moorfield again for several weeks. He did not know what she was building. He did not know what she remembered. And he did not know, could not possibly have known, that the woman he had written off as a temporary problem was at that moment standing in a hole in the ground with dirt under her nails and a plan in her head that was older than the country they both lived in. He would find out. Everyone would, but not yet. The first thing Winifred built after the hole was the floor, and the floor nearly broke her. The dry creek bed, a quarter-mile east of the house, held the kind of stone she needed. Flat pieces wide as a dinner plate, heavy as a full milk pail, scattered among the gravel and scrub brush that lined the bank. She loaded them into the wheelbarrow one at a time, testing each stone with her thumb for flatness and thickness, discarding anything that wobbled or crumbled at the edge. A good stone rang faintly when she tapped it with the back of the spade. A bad stone made a dull sound and split along a hidden seam. She made the trip 4 afternoons in a row. A quarter mile there, a quarter mile back, the wheelbarrow heavy enough on the return that the handles dug grooves into her palms, even through the calluses she had built over the past 3 weeks. Each load held perhaps 8 stones. The floor required over 60. She laid them in 2 layers across the full 18 by 12 feet, fitting them together the way Lawson had once shown her how to lay a plank floor, staggering the joints so that no gap in the upper layer aligned with a yam below. On the third afternoon, pushing the wheelbarrow up the slight grade toward the site, her left boot caught a prairie dog hole concealed beneath the grass. Her ankle turned. She went down hard on one knee, and the wheelbarrow tipped forward, spilling stones across the ground. She knelt there for a full minute, eyes closed, hands flat in the dirt, breathing. Then she reloaded the stones one by one and kept walking. She did not tell anyone about the fall. There was no one to tell. Through September and into October, the walls went up. She stacked the sod blocks she had cut during the excavation in a running bond pattern, each block offset from the one below it so that no two vertical seams aligned, packing the gaps with loose soil and dried grass. 3 feet of wall above grade, giving the structure an overall interior height of 8.5 feet at the center. Tall enough to stand upright, tall enough to feel human rather than buried. The roof was the hardest part, and the part that scared her most, because the roof is where a mistake would not simply be inconvenient. It would be fatal. A roof that sagged would trap moisture. A roof that collapsed under snow would kill everyone beneath it. Winifred had never built a roof in her life. Lawson had built every roof she had ever lived under. Now Lawson was gone and the roof was hers. She cut 8 cottonwood poles from the stand along the creek, each one roughly 8 feet long. The cutting took a full day. Cottonwood is a soft wood, easy to saw but difficult to shape, and Winifred needed the tops of the poles hewn flat so they would sit level across the walls. She had Lawson's hatchet, the good one, the one he had kept sharp enough to shave with, and she used it to flatten each pole in, working slowly, checking the surface against the wall top after every few strokes. The first pole she ruined. Cut too deep on one side, the flat surface angled instead of level, and when she laid it across the walls, it rocked like a chair with one short leg. She pulled it down and tried again on a fresh pole. The second attempt was better, but still not right. The angle was off by perhaps a quarter inch, barely visible, but she could feel it in her hands when she pressed down a faint unevenness that would translate over the weight of 18 inches of sod and snow into a stress point that might crack the pole in February. She sat on the ground beside the second failed pole and held Lawson's hatchet in both hands. The handle was worn smooth where his grip had been a shallow depression shaped exactly like his palm, and Winifred's hand did not fit it perfectly. Her fingers were shorter. Her grip was narrower. She had to hold it slightly forward of the natural position, which changed the angle of the swing, which was why the cuts kept coming in wrong. She adjusted. She choked up on the handle, gripping it where the wood was still rough, and she swung again. This time the blade bit clean and flat. She checked the surface. Level. She checked it again. Level. She ran her finger along the cut and felt nothing but smooth wood. The third pole was right on the first try. So was the fourth. By the eighth pole, her arms were shaking and her shoulders burned, but every cut was clean. She had found her own grip, not Lawson's, not better or worse, just hers, and it worked. She laid the poles across the walls, spaced 8 inches apart, and covered them with tar paper she had purchased in Huron for $11.60. Nearly half her remaining cash spent on a roll of black treated paper that smelled like creosote and stuck to her hands in the heat. Over the tar paper, she laid 18 inches of packed sod grass, side down the same blocks she had cut from the prairie, but placed inverted so the root systems would grow downward into the layer beneath and bind the whole mass together over time. When the roof was finished, Winifred stood back and looked at what she had made. It was not beautiful. It was a low mound of earth and grass that rose from the prairie like a blister, with a dark opening on the southeast side and a metal pipe poking from the top. It looked like something that had always been there, something the land had grown on its own, and in a way that was exactly right, because the best thing about this structure was that it did not fight the land. It sat inside it. It belonged. But Winifred needed one more thing before it would work, and she did not have the money for a new one. The Sinclair family was leaving. Cyrus Sinclair and his wife had come to the territory 3 years ago full of plans and had watched those plans die in 2 consecutive failed wheat harvests. And now they were packing a wagon and heading back to Ohio, where Cyrus's brother had offered him work in a feed store. They were selling everything they could not carry. Winifred walked to the Sinclair place on a Tuesday morning and found Mrs. Sinclair wrapping dishes in newspaper beside the wagon. The cast-iron box stove sat in the yard, 61 pounds of black metal with a flat top and a firebox that could hold a quarter quart of split wood. $6, Mrs. Sinclair said. Winifred had four. She had exactly $4 in cash after the tar paper and the nails and the tin cap for the chimney pipe. And she stood in the Sinclair yard with the money in her hand and her daughter standing by the fence. And she said, "I have four." Mrs. Sinclair looked at the $4. She looked at Winifred's girls. She looked back at her husband, who was lashing a trunk to the wagon and not paying attention. Then she looked at the stove which she had cooked on for 3 years, which she had heated water on for baths, which she had stood beside on winter mornings, waiting for the metal to warm enough to stop her hands from shaking. $4, Mrs. Sinclair said. Take it. She said it not out of pity. She said it because she was tired and broke, and she did not want to haul 61 pounds of iron to Ohio. But as Winifred loaded the stove onto the sled she had brought with Astrid and Corinne pushing from behind, Mrs. Sinclair said something to her husband that Winifred overheard. "That woman is either out of her mind," Mrs. Sinclair said, "or she knows something the rest of us don't." Cyrus Sinclair did not respond. He was already thinking about Ohio. Winifred dragged the stove home on the sled. It took most of the afternoon. The sled runners caught in the grass and the ruts of the wagon track, and the stove was heavy enough that every uphill grade, even a slight one, required all three of them pulling and pushing in coordination. Astrid pulled the rope alongside her mother. Corinne pushed from behind with her small hands flat against the warm black iron. At one point, the sled tipped sideways, and the stove nearly slid off, and Winifred caught it with her body bracing the full weight against her hip, while Astrid scrambled to right the sled. The stove left a bruise on Winifred's hip that lasted 3 weeks. She did not care about the bruise. She cared about the stove. When they reached the shelter, she guided the sled down the entrance ramp into the underground chamber and set the stove on the raised stone platform she had built in the northeast corner. She connected the stovepipe, ran it up through the sod roof at the slight angle she had planned, sealed the collar with sheet metal and clay, and capped it with tin. She stepped back. She looked at the stove sitting on its stone platform in the corner of the underground room, the pipe rising at its careful angle through the earth above, and she felt something she had not felt in months. She felt ready, not confident, not certain, but ready. And then Prentice Whitmore came back. It was early October. The light had changed. The grass had gone from green to gold, and the mornings carried a sharpness that was not yet cold, but was clearly heading there. Whitmore arrived in a buckboard with another man, a quiet, heavy-set man he introduced as a business associate from Sioux Falls. The associate stood by the wagon and did not speak. Whitmore got straight to it. He had a new number, $260, $60 less than before. He explained why, and his explanations were the worst kind of persuasion because they were true. Winifred had spent money on what he called the excavation instead of improving the farm. No crops had been planted, no livestock had been purchased. The value of the land had decreased because there was no visible evidence of productive use. And the market, Whitmore said, does not pay for potential. It pays for results. No one in this area will lease you labor when they need it for their own land, Whitmore said. No bank will extend you credit based on what you have now. I'm offering you a clean exit, Mrs. Moorfield. That's becoming a rare thing. Winifred said, I'm not selling Mr. Whitmore. This time her voice was steady. This time there was no tremor, no hesitation, no not ready, just no. Whitmore's jaw tightened just barely, just enough for Winifred to notice. Then he said something that she would carry with her through the rest of the autumn and into the winter and for a long time after that. Mrs. Moorfield, I have seen a lot of stubborn people on this land. The land does not reward stubbornness. The land rewards practicality. He paused. Then softer, almost gentle, he said, I don't want to read your name in the obituary column next spring. That's the truth, not a threat. He climbed back into the buckboard. The associate from Sioux Falls climbed up beside him. They drove away without looking back. Winifred stood in the yard watching the dust settle behind the wagon. Her hands were at her sides. Her face showed nothing. But inside, in the place where she kept the things she did not show anyone, the place that had been filling slowly with doubt since the day Lawson stopped breathing, something cracked. Not broke, cracked. The way ice cracks before it gives way. A sound you can feel more than hear. That night, after the girls were asleep in the frame house, Winifred went down into the underground chamber alone. She lit a small fire in the stove, sat on the stone floor, and listened to the silence. The chamber was finished. The walls were solid. The roof was tight. The stove drew well. Everything was exactly as Dagny had described, as near as Winifred could remember and replicate. And it looked right, and it felt right, and none of that was enough. Because Whitmore's words were in her head now, not the insult about stubbornness, but the other thing. The thing about the obituary column. The thing about reading her name next spring. And worse than that, not her name. Astrid's name. Corinne's name. Winifred put her face in her hands and cried. Not for Lawson. She had already cried for Lawson. She cried because she was sitting alone in a hole in the ground, in the dark, in the Dakota territory in October, betting her daughter's lives on the memory of a 10-year-old girl listening to her grandmother talk. And she did not know if that memory was precise enough, detailed enough, true enough to keep 3 people alive through what everyone said was coming. What if she had remembered the angles wrong? What if the drainage was insufficient? What if the sod roof collapsed under 4 feet of snow? What if the stove drew poorly and filled the chamber with smoke? What if Dagny's knowledge, perfect in a Norwegian hillside with centuries of tradition behind it, simply did not translate to a flat prairie with a 3.5-foot rise and cottonwood poles and a $4 stove? She cried until she was empty. Then she stopped. She wiped her face with her sleeve. And she did something that was not emotion and was not faith. It was engineering. She fed the stove until it was burning at full capacity. She sealed the entrance with the oiled cloth she had prepared. And she waited. After 1 hour, she placed a pat of butter on a tin plate and set it on the stone floor 6 feet from the stove. The butter softened but did not melt. Above 50 degrees, below 60. After 2 hours, she let the fire die to coals and touch the wall. Warm. After 4 hours, coals nearly gone, she touched the wall again. Still warm, faintly unmistakably warm, the heat held in the earth and stone, and released so slowly that the air in the chamber had not dropped more than a few degrees despite the fire being nearly dead. Dagny was right, not because Winifred believed it, because the butter did not lie and the walls did not lie and the stone floor radiating its quiet, steady warmth did not lie. Winifred climbed out of the chamber, walked back to the frame house, looked at her daughters sleeping in their beds, and made her decision. Next week, she would move them underground. She did not go back to sleep. She sat at the kitchen table until dawn, and the feeling in her chest was not joy and not relief. It was the grim, private satisfaction of a person who has tested a thing and found it sound, and who knows that the testing is not over. Not remotely, but who also knows that the first and hardest test has been passed. By early November, word had gotten around. A woman digging a large hole in her field for 2 months was not something that went unremarked in a community of 12 families spread across 40 square miles of open prairie, where the most exciting event of the average week was a change in wind direction. People talked. People came to look. Anson Yardley was first on a Saturday morning with his eldest son, Jasper. Anson stood at the entrance to the structure for a long time without speaking. He walked around it. He looked at the stovepipe. He looked at the saw roof. He looked at the entrance tunnel. Then he said that he had never seen anything like it and that he supposed Winifred had her reasons, but that it looked to him like a root cellar that had gotten out of hand. Jasper, who was 17 and carried himself with the unearned confidence that 17-year-old boys on the frontier tend to carry like a loaded weapon, looked at the entrance and said, "Looks like a grave." He did not say it to be cruel. He said it because he believed it. He believed that what Winifred had built was a place where a desperate woman had decided to die quietly away from the wind. He said it the way young men say things that are wrong but sound true with absolute conviction, and it landed in the silence between them like a stone dropped into still water. Anson said nothing to correct his son. That was what Winifred noticed. Not Jasper's words, but Anson's silence after them. There was a girl standing behind them. Vivian Yardley, 15. Anson's daughter. She had come along but stayed farther back than her father and brother, watching. She did not speak while they were there, but as the family turned to leave, Vivian hung back for a moment and looked at Winifred, who was standing beside the entrance with dirt on her sleeves and her hair pulled back in a knot. "Mrs. Moorfield," Vivian said quietly, "is it warm inside?" It was the first question anyone had asked Winifred. That was not advice, not judgment, not pity, not a gentle suggestion that she sell the land and go east. It was curiosity, plain, honest, direct curiosity from a girl who wanted to know the answer. Winifred nodded. "Warmer than you'd think." Vivian said nothing else. She turned and followed her family. But something had passed between them in that moment, a transaction so small that neither of them could have named it that would matter very much later. 2 days after the Yardleys came, Pastor Abner Underhill arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, hat in hand, voice gentle. He asked whether Winifred had given thought to the circuit pastor's offer to arrange passage to Wisconsin. He said it with the kind of genuine care that is almost impossible to argue with because it comes from a good place, a place of real concern for another person's welfare, and arguing with genuine care makes you feel like you are the one being unreasonable. Then he said the thing that cut deepest. "Winifred, I have buried 14 people on this land in 6 years. I don't want to bury 3 more because of pride." Winifred looked at him. She wanted to say that it was not pride. She wanted to say that it was knowledge, that it was engineering, and it was the accumulated wisdom of generations of Scandinavian builders encoded in the memory of a woman who had listened when no one else would. But she did not say any of that because in that moment she was not fully certain that the pastor was wrong. The line between pride and knowledge is thinner than anyone wants to admit, and Winifred was standing on that line and she knew it. She thanked him. He left. She went back to work. The widow Mabel Stratton came last, not to criticize, but out of genuine worried confusion. Mabel stood looking at the mound of earth with its dark entrance and its thin pipe, and she said nothing for a long time. Then she asked simply, "Winifred, are you sure?" And Winifred for the first time said more than thank you. She said, "Mrs. Stratton, how did you survive your first winter after Miss Stratton died?" Mabel was quiet, then she said, "I don't know, I just didn't die." Winifred nodded. "I'm trying to do better than didn't die. I'm trying to do lived." Mabel looked at the entrance one more time. She looked at Winifred. Something shifted behind her eyes, something that was not agreement exactly, but was no longer opposition. She walked home, and from that day forward, she did not tell anyone that Winifred should sell. On November 15th, Winifred moved her daughter's beds into the underground chamber. She built a small partition of sod blocks at the southern end to give them a private sleeping space, and she hung oiled cloth over the entrance tunnel to block drafts. That first night underground, Corinne was afraid. She lay in her bed in the dim light of the stove, and she said, "Mama, we're under the ground, like Papa." Winifred stopped what she was doing. She had anticipated many things. She had calculated burn rates and food stores and drainage angles and thermal performance. She had not anticipated this, the simple, devastating logic of a 5-year-old. Papa went under the ground. Now we are going under the ground. The conclusion was obvious. Winifred sat on the edge of Corinne's bed and held her daughter's face in both hands. "Papa is under the ground to rest," she said. "We are under the ground to live." From the other side of the partition, Astrid's voice came through the cloth divider, steady and calm, in a way that made Winifred's heart clench because 8 years old should not sound that calm. "Can you feel it, Corinne? The ground is warm. It's like someone holding you." Corinne was quiet, then she closed her eyes and slept. Winifred lay awake for a long time, listening to the wind moving across the surface above her, a sound that was muffled and far away, like hearing the ocean from inside a ship. She thought, "This is the first time I have talked about Lawson without the pain being the biggest part of it. Just the memory, just him." In late November, Vivian Yardley came back, alone, without telling her family. She stood at the entrance to the tunnel and said that her brother Jasper called Winifred the crazy grave woman at dinner every night, and that her father shook his head but did not disagree. Then she asked if she could see inside. Winifred brought her in. Vivian stood in the center of the chamber and turned slowly, taking it in. The stove in its corner, the stone floor, the beds behind the partition, the shelves Winifred had built along one wall stacked with crocks and sacks and jars. Vivian reached out and placed her palm flat against the wall, the way Winifred herself had done on the 19th day of digging, and the girl's face changed. "It's warm," Vivian said. Then, "It doesn't look like a grave at all. It looks like a home." Winifred set a cup of warm water in front of her and said nothing. Vivian went home and told no one. But every week after that, Winifred found a small sack of potatoes sitting in the basket outside the entrance tunnel. She never asked who left them. She did not need to ask. Through the rest of November and into December, Winifred built the secondary chamber, a smaller room connected to the main space by a low doorway, dug deeper, 6.5 feet below grade, unheated, designed for cold storage. She stacked into it the supplies she had spent the summer and fall preparing. 260 pounds of potatoes, 90 pounds of dried beans, 40 pounds of cornmeal, 68 quarts of preserved vegetables in wax-sealed crocks, 4 smoked hams, a 50-pound sack of flour. Against the south-facing wall of the structure, above grade covered with a canvas tarpaulin, weighted with stones, she stacked 3 cords of split firewood, a mix of cottonwood and ash. She had done the math by firelight, scratching figures into the margin of her almanac with a pencil stub. 3 cords in a well-insulated underground space at moderate burn rates would last roughly 60 days. She knew her consumption. She knew her supply. And she knew with the cold certainty of arithmetic that 60 days would either be enough or it would not, and there was nothing more she could do about it. In mid-December, the cold came. Temperatures dropped to 18 below zero and held there for a week. It was brutal but manageable for families with adequate firewood and a tight house. The underground chamber stayed above 50 degrees with minimal fuel. Winifred rationed her wood carefully, burning less than she could have, banking heat into the walls and floor for what she sensed was coming. Then in the last days of December, the temperature rose. The wind shifted to the south. The air softened. Snow that had been dry and hard began to feel wet. Some people in the territory took this as a sign that the worst had passed. Winifred did not take it as a good sign. She recognized the pattern from something Dagny had described once, not in a diagram, but in words spoken quietly on a summer evening in Minnesota. When the air warms suddenly in the deep winter on the northern plains, it means a massive low-pressure system is drawing moisture from the south, loading the atmosphere with water, and when the Arctic air returns, all that water will come down as snow. The warming was not relief. It was preparation. The sky was loading itself like a weapon. Winifred spent the first day of January pushing the stove harder than she had since installing it, filling the firebox full and letting it burn hot for hours, saturating the surrounding earth and stone with as much warmth as they could hold. She dragged an extra half cord of firewood inside the tunnel entrance. She checked every crock, counted every potato, weighed the flour sack in her hands. Anson Yardley passed by on his way to check fence line and saw Winifred hauling wood. He stopped and asked what she was preparing for. Winifred said, "For what's coming." Anson looked up at the sky. Clear, mild. The wind was light and the sun was visible, and there was nothing in the air that suggested anything but a pleasant thaw. He smiled and shook his head. "You worry too much, Mrs. Moorfield." He drove on. He did not pull extra firewood under cover that afternoon. He did not check the roof of his barn for weak spots. He did not fill extra water containers inside his house. He went home and ate supper and told Fern that the thaw was a good sign and that the worst was probably behind them. Winifred watched him go. She said nothing. There was nothing to say. You cannot explain what you feel in your bones to someone who trusts only what they can see with their eyes. And Anson Yardley was a man who trusted his eyes, and his eyes told him the sky was clear. On the evening of January the 4th, the sky was no longer clear. The snow started just after dark, not gently, not gradually. It came in sideways, driven by a wind that had swung from south to northwest in less than an hour, a wind that did not gust and fade the way normal wind does, but pressed against the walls of the frame house with a sustained, deliberate pressure, as if the air itself had decided to lean on everything in its path and not let up. Winifred was already underground with Astrid and Corinne. The stove was burning steady. The oilcloth over the entrance tunnel moved in the draft but held. The girls were in their beds behind the partition. Winifred sat on a stool beside the stove and listened to the sound coming from above. A sound that was not wind anymore, but something larger. Something that had weight and intention. Something that sounded like the whole sky pressing itself flat against the earth. Astrid said from behind the partition, "Mama, is it going to be big?" Winifred said, It's going to be loud, but we're going to be warm. And the storm roared on. It would not stop for 61 hours. The storm lasted 61 hours. That number deserves to sit by itself for a moment, because most people have never experienced that duration of anything, let alone that duration of a force that is actively trying to kill them. 2.5 days. It is long enough to forget what silence sounds like. It is long enough for the sound of wind to stop being sound and become the texture of reality itself, the permanent background of existence, so constant and so loud that when it finally stops, your ears ring in the emptiness and the quiet feels wrong, feels like something is missing, like the world has lost a fundamental part of itself. The wind was measured by the weather station in Huron at sustained speeds of 42 miles per hour, with gusts recorded at 61. The temperature outside was 20 degrees below zero, which at those wind speeds produced a wind chill equivalent of 67 below. Exposed skin freezes in under 4 minutes at that temperature. A person who becomes disoriented 50 yards from their own front door can die before they find it. The total snowfall reached 31 inches of dense wind-packed snow that drifted to depths of 8 and 10 feet on the sheltered side of any structure, fence line, or rise in the ground. 3 barns within 12 miles of Winifred's farm collapsed under the weight. One of them belonged to Emmett Calloway. The Calloway barn came down on the night of January 6th. Lottie Calloway heard it from inside the house, a sound she would later describe to Winifred as something between a scream and a groan, wood splitting and nails pulling free, and the whole structure folding in on itself in a single long exhalation. 11 cattle and 2 horses died beneath the wreckage. Emmett ran outside into the storm, was gone for 10 minutes, and came back through the door, white-faced and silent. He did not tell Lottie what he had seen. He did not need to. She read it on his face the way a wife reads 20 years of marriage in a single glance. Their house, a frame structure Emmett had built himself with good timber and reasonable skill, did not collapse. But the firewood ran low on the second day. Emmett had stacked his supply outside a cord and a half against the north wall of the house, and the drift had buried it under 5 feet of compacted snow and ice. He went out twice with an axe and came back with barely enough to fill his arms, the wood frozen into a solid mass that his blade bounced off of. By the morning of January 7th, the temperature inside the Calloway house had dropped to 31 degrees. Their youngest child, a boy of 3, began to shake. Lottie knew what the shaking meant. She had seen it once before years ago in a neighbor's child who had been caught outside too long. The shaking was the body trying to generate heat by contracting every muscle it had over and over, an involuntary, desperate, mechanical response to cold that the body performs without asking permission. And when the shaking stops, that is not a good sign. That is the body giving up. Lottie pulled the boy against her chest, wrapped every blanket they owned around both of them, and held him. She held him for 20 hours. She did not sleep. She did not eat. She pressed her body against his and pulled her warmth into him through skin and cloth and bone, and every time his shaking slowed, she tightened her grip and whispered into his hair that he was safe, that Mama was here, that the cold could not get him. She did not know if that was true. She only knew that she would not let go. 12 miles away in the underground chamber, the temperature never dropped below 53 degrees. Winifred burned 1.5 armloads of wood per day, a fraction of what any house above ground would have consumed. She cooked on the stove. Her daughters slept in their beds. The walls held their warmth. The stone floor radiated gently. The air inside was still and dry and smelled like wood smoke and cornmeal in earth, which is not a pleasant smell exactly, but it is a smell of survival. And survival has its own beauty when the alternative is 20 degrees below zero and falling. On the second night, Astrid asked if they could have warm milk before sleeping. Winifred heated milk on the stove and poured it into 2 tin cups, and her daughters drank it sitting on their beds with their blankets around their shoulders. Corinne held the cup in both hands and closed her eyes and breathed the steam. Astrid drank hers slowly, making it last. Outside, the storm was killing livestock. Inside, a woman heated milk for her daughters. When the wind finally stopped on the morning of January 7th, the silence was so complete that Winifred thought for a moment something was wrong with her hearing. She had been listening to the roar for so long that its absence felt physical. A pressure removed from the sides of her head, and she stood at the base of the entrance tunnel for a full minute, just listening to nothing before she climbed up and pushed through the oiled cloth and emerged into a world she did not recognize. Everything was white, not the white of a light snowfall that dusts the fields and melts by afternoon. A total blinding absolute white that extended in every direction to the horizon and erased every familiar landmark. The frame house 30 yards away had survived, the roof still intact, but the north-facing wall had a drift against it 8 feet tall, and the door on that side was buried entirely. The woodpile beside the house, imperfectly covered, had taken on 2 inches of ice beneath the snow. But what Winifred noticed first was not the snow or the ice or the buried door. It was the smoke, or rather the absence of it. She looked west toward the Yardley farm half a mile away, and she saw no smoke rising from the chimney. The house was there, sullen dark against the white field, but the chimney was cold. A cold chimney on a morning like this, 24 below zero, under a sky so clear and hard, it looked like blue metal, meant one of two things. Either the family had left, which was impossible because there was nowhere to go and no road to get there, or they had run out of fuel. Winifred went back inside the chamber. She put on her heaviest coat, the one with the wool lining that Lawson had bought for her in Huron 3 years ago. Too expensive, he had said, but worth it because he wanted her to be warm. She pulled Lawson's old wool trousers over her own, laced her boots tight, wrapped a scarf around her face, and told Astrid to keep the stove fed and the entrance covered. Astrid, 8 years old, looked at her mother and nodded the way soldiers nod when they receive an order they understand. Winifred climbed out of the tunnel and began walking west through snow that came to her thighs. The half-mile to the Yardley farm took her 40 minutes. Every step was a negotiation with the snow, each foot plunging through the crust and sinking into the powder beneath, and she had to lift her knee nearly to her waist to pull free for the next step. The cold was not like cold she had felt before. It was not the passive cold of a winter morning, the kind that makes you walk faster and pull your collar up. It was aggressive. It reached through her coat and her trousers and her scarf and put its hands on her skin and squeezed. Her eyelashes froze together twice. She wiped them clear with her glove and kept walking. Anson Yardley opened the door before she reached it. He had seen her coming across the field, a dark shape moving through the white, impossibly slow, impossibly determined. And he had watched her for several minutes before he understood that it was Winifred Moorfield, the woman whose underground structure his own son had called a grave, walking through thigh-deep snow at 24 below zero to reach his house. He opened the door and she saw everything at once. Fern Yardley sitting in a chair by the cold stove with a blanket around her shoulders, coughing in a way that Winifred recognized, the deep, wet cough that starts in the chest and does not come from a cold, but from days of breathing air that is too cold for human lungs. The 3 Yardley children huddled together on the bed, the youngest a girl of 6, wrapped in every piece of cloth the family owned. Jasper standing by the window with his arms crossed, jaw tight, looking at nothing. And Vivian standing apart from the others, already wearing her coat. Anson's face told the story before he spoke. He had used the last of his dry wood that morning. The cord and a half outside was frozen into a solid block. His axe had bounced off it until his arms gave out. The inside temperature had dropped to 38 degrees and was still falling. He looked at Winifred, the woman he had told not to worry, the woman he had warned was wasting her time, the woman whose project he had compared to a root cellar gone wrong. He looked at her and he did not speak for a long time. Then he said quietly, "That shelter of yours, is it still warm?" 53 degrees since the storm started, Winifred said. Anson closed his eyes. When he opened them, something had changed in his face. Not shame exactly, something older than shame. The recognition that he had been wrong, completely wrong, about something that mattered more than his pride, and that the person who had been right was the person he had doubted most. "Lead the way," he said. Jasper spoke from the window without turning around. "I'm not going into that grave." Anson turned to face his son. He was not angry. He was too tired and too cold, and too aware of what was at stake to waste energy on anger. He simply looked at his 17-year-old boy and said, "Jasper, your sister is shaking. We're going." Jasper looked at the 6-year-old on the bed, her small body curled tight, her lips pale, her eyes half closed. He uncrossed his arms. He did not apologize. He did not take back what he had said about the grave. He simply walked to the bed and picked up his little sister and carried her to the door. Vivian was already outside. She had not needed to be told. Winifred brought the Yardley family to the underground chamber. Then she sent Anson south to fetch the widow Mabel Stratton. Then she walked north another quarter-mile through the snow to fetch Pastor Abner Underhill and his housekeeper Mrs. Kessler, an elderly woman who had not been warm in 2 days and whose hands, when Winifred took them in her own, were the color of candle wax. By the time Winifred returned to the shelter with the pastor and Mrs. Kessler, she had been walking through deep snow for nearly 3 hours. Her legs burned from the effort of lifting each step free of the crust. Her toes had gone numb inside her boots and had not come back. The scarf across her face was a solid sheet of ice from her breath. She stood inside the shelter for 10 minutes, drinking warm water, feeling the blood return to her feet in painful jolts, and she knew she should stop. She knew her body was telling her something urgent and clear. "You have done enough. You have saved 7 people. Sit down." But she also knew that 3 miles to the east, Emmett Calloway's barn had been groaning under the weight of snow for 2 days, and Emmett's firewood was stacked outside, and the Calloway boy was 3 years old. 3 years old is not old enough to survive a house at 30 degrees for very long. 3 years old is barely old enough to tell you what hurts. Winifred laced her boots again. She put on her coat again. She wrapped the frozen scarf around her face again. Astrid was standing by the stove watching her mother dress for the 3rd time. The girl did not speak. She did not ask where her mother was going or when she would be back. She simply reached into the woodpile and placed 2 pieces of cottonwood into the firebox, exactly the ration her mother had shown her, and then she stood beside the stove like a small soldier guarding a post that was too important to leave. Winifred looked at her daughter, 8 years old, standing in an underground room keeping 9 people warm, while her mother walked into a frozen world where a single wrong turn, a single fall, a single moment of confusion could end everything. She wanted to say something. She wanted to say, "I am proud of you," or "I love you," or "I will come back." But she did not say any of those things because all of them implied a doubt she could not afford to carry. She simply nodded. Astrid nodded back. And Winifred climbed out of the tunnel and walked east. The walk to the Calloway farm was the longest of the 3. A full mile and a half across open prairie with no windbreak and no trail and no visible landmark except the low dark shape of the Callaway house sitting in the white distance like a bruise on a blank page. The sun was low and weak and gave no warmth. The cold had settled into Winifred's joints and was working its way into her thinking, slowing her decisions, making each step feel not just difficult but optional, as though the snow were offering her a reasonable alternative. Lie down, rest. The snow is soft. You have done enough. She did not lie down. She counted her steps instead. 100 steps, then look up. 100 more, then look up again. The house was closer. 100 more. Closer still. She found Emmett and Lottie and the 3-year-old boy who had been shaking for 12 hours, but was still alive because his mother had not let go of him for a single minute. By the evening of January 7th, the underground chamber that Jasper Yardley had called a grave held 9 people and a nursing infant, 7 weeks old, born into a world that had immediately tried to freeze it. There was food enough for 40 days. There was fuel enough to last. It was crowded. There were not enough chairs. There were not enough beds. Children slept in shifts, and those who were not sleeping sat on the stone floor on folded blankets and leaned against the walls. 9 adults and children breathing in 216 square feet, the air thick with body heat and wood smoke, and the smell of too many people in too small a space. The temperature with 9 people and a moderate fire never dropped below 58 degrees. On some evenings, it reached 64. On the second night inside the chamber, the tension broke. Emmett Callaway stood up. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, strong from years of farm work. And when he stood in that low-ceilinged room, he seemed to fill it. He had lost 11 cattle and 2 horses. His barn was a pile of broken wood under the snow. His son had nearly died, and he was sitting in a hole in the ground, being told how much firewood he was allowed to burn by a woman half his size. "We need more heat," he said. "My boy was shaking 12 hours ago. 58 degrees is not enough." Winifred was standing by the stove. She did not move. "Your boy's color is back. He's sleeping. He's warm." "He's not warm enough. None of us are warm enough. Put more wood on." "If I put more wood on, we run out before the road's clear. Then nobody is warm." Emmett stepped closer. He was a foot taller than Winifred, and probably 80 pounds heavier, and in the dim light of the stove, his shadow covered her completely. "This is not your house, Mrs. Moorfield. This is a shelter. Everyone here has a voice." The room went silent. Fern Yardley held her sick chest and did not breathe. Lottie Callaway clutched her sleeping boy. Pastor Underhill sat on his stool in the corner and watched. Mabel Stratton, old and thin and utterly still, looked at Emmett with an expression that could have been fear or could have been something much harder. Winifred did not step back. She looked up at Emmett Callaway, and she spoke in a voice that was not loud, was not angry, was not pleading. It was the voice of a woman who had done the arithmetic and knew the answer. "Mr. Callaway, I understand you're afraid for your son. I'm afraid for my daughters too. But I know the burn rate of this stove, and I know how much wood is left, and I know how many days we need it to last. If we burn more now, we will be sitting in the dark in 8 days. Your boy is alive because this chamber is holding at 58 degrees. Trust me for one more night." Emmett did not sit down. He stood there, breathing his fists at his sides, caught between the terror of a father who has almost lost his child and the logic of a woman who was right and who he knew was right, and those two forces pulled at him from opposite directions. Anson Yardley rose from where he had been sitting against the wall. Slowly, stiffly, his joints ached from the cold walk and his pride ached from something deeper. "Sit down, Emmett," Anson said. His voice was low and steady, and carried the weight of a man admitting something that cost him. I stood where you're standing 2 months ago. I told this woman she was wasting her time. I told her she was digging her own grave. I was wrong. She was right. She built this. She knows what it can take. Sit down. The room held its breath. Emmett looked at Anson. He looked at Winifred. He looked at his son, asleep on Lottie's lap, cheeks flushed pink, breathing deep and even. The boy was alive. The boy was warm. The boy was warm because of this room that this woman had built with a spade and a wheelbarrow, while every person in the community watched and judged and offered their kind useless advice. Emmett sat down. He did not speak again that night. Later, after the children were settled and the fire was banked low, Pastor Abner Underhill removed his coat. He had been wearing it since he arrived out of habit, out of the instinct that says, you keep your coat on when you are not home because you might need to leave. But he was not leaving. None of them were leaving. And the room was warm enough that the coat was unnecessary, and the act of removing it was not about temperature. It was about surrender. It was about accepting that this place, this hole in the ground, this space that he had gently tried to talk Winifred out of building was the safest place within 20 miles. He folded the coat in his lap. He sat quietly for a long time. Then he said, barely above a whisper, I owe you a very great apology, Mrs. Moorfield. Winifred was kneading cornmeal for the morning's porridge. She did not look up. Pastor Underhill, you don't owe me an apology. You cared about me. That was all you knew how to do. Underhill lowered his head. In all the years he served that congregation through blizzards and droughts and funerals and births, he never forgot what Winifred Moorfield said to him in a hole in the ground on the second night of the worst storm in the history of the Dakota Territory. He had come to her with kindness and been completely wrong, and she had forgiven him not with generosity but with understanding, which is harder and rarer and costs more. That same evening, Jasper Yardley sat cross-legged on the stone floor beside Astrid and taught her to play cards with the torn deck he had found in his coat pocket. He shuffled badly. Astrid watched his hands with the focused attention of a child who takes games seriously. She won the third hand and Jasper laughed. It was the first laugh anyone had heard in the chamber since the storm began. The sound of it moved through the room, the way warmth moves through stone, slowly reaching everyone. Vivian, sitting against the wall with her knees drawn up, watched her brother laugh in the place he had called a grave, and she smiled but said nothing because some things do not need to be said. Over the following 11 days, the chamber functioned as a shelter, a kitchen, a nursery, and a community that none of its inhabitants had planned or chosen, but that all of them needed. Winifred cooked bean soup and cornmeal porridge, and twice managed a ham broth that the children drank with something close to reverence, cupping the warm bowls and breathing the steam before taking their first sip. She rationed the firewood not by feel but by count, marking each day's consumption on the wall with a piece of charcoal and calculating forward to the day the roads would be passable. The days took on a rhythm. Winifred rose first each morning, fed the stove, put water on to heat, and began the day's cooking before anyone else stirred. Lottie Calloway, who had not let go of her son for nearly a full day, gradually loosened her grip over the first 2 mornings as the boy's color returned and his appetite came back, and he began crawling around the stone floor, getting into everything. By the 3rd morning, the boy was pulling himself up on the edge of the stove platform, and Lottie was telling him no, with a sharpness in her voice that sounded to everyone in the room exactly like normal. Life and the sound of a mother scolding a toddler was so ordinary and so beautiful that Fern Yardley, who had been coughing for days, laughed through her cough, and the laugh turned into more coughing, and Winifred brought her warm water, and that was how the mornings went. Emmett Calloway, after the confrontation on the second night, became the quietest person in the room. He sat against the wall with his hands on his knees and he watched. He watched Winifred cook. He watched her ration wood. He watched her check the stovepipe seal when the wind shifted. He watched her touch the wall each morning to read the temperature with her palm the way a doctor reads a pulse with fingertips. He did not speak about what he saw, but on the fourth morning, without being asked, he stood up and carried the heavy water bucket up the entrance ramp to fill it with snow, for melting, a task Winifred had been doing herself. And when he came back down, he set the bucket beside the stove and sat back down and said nothing, and Winifred said nothing, and the silence between them was different from the silence of the second night. It was the silence of a debt being repaid in the only currency available. On the third day, Vivian began helping Winifred cook. She stood beside the stove and peeled potatoes and stirred the pot and did not need to be told what to do next, which Winifred found remarkable in a 15-year-old, and which told her something about Vivian that she had suspected since the girl first came to visit alone in November. Vivian was paying attention. Vivian had always been paying attention, while her father shook his head and her brother mocked. Vivian had been watching and learning and coming back, and she was the reason there were extra potatoes in the storage room, and Winifred had known it all along. "Mrs. Moorfield," Vivian said on the third morning while they were alone by the stove, "where did you learn all of this?" Winifred said, "From a woman no one thought was worth listening to." Vivian nodded slowly, as though the answer confirmed something she had already worked out on her own. On the sixth day, Mabel Stratton began telling stories to the children, fairy tales and old legends she remembered from her own childhood, and when she ran out, she asked Winifred if she had any. And Winifred, for the first time, told someone outside her family about Dagny, about the valley in Norway, about the house built into the hillside above the fjord, about a woman who had carried knowledge across an ocean and kept it alive in a new country by telling it to a granddaughter who was willing to listen. Mrs. Kessler, the pastor's housekeeper, sat in the corner and listened to every word. When Winifred finished, the old woman said, "So you didn't invent this, you remembered it." Winifred said, "Someone remembered it before me, and someone before her." On the ninth day, Anson Yardley sat watching Winifred divide the firewood for the day. She counted the pieces. She weighed them in her hands. She calculated how many hours each piece would burn and how many degrees it would contribute and how many pieces remained and how many days those pieces needed to last. He watched her the way a man watches someone perform a skill he does not have and has only just realized he does not have. He leaned over to Emmett, who was sitting beside him, and said quietly, not intending Winifred to hear, "This is not a woman who panicked and dug a hole. This is an engineer. She did engineering with a spade and a wheelbarrow and a $4 stove." Emmett said nothing, but he did not disagree. By the time the last families returned to their own farms in the third week of January 31, people had spent some portion of the worst cold snap of the 1886 to 1887 winter in Winifred Moorfield's underground structure. None of them had frostbite. None of them had hypothermia. The Calloway boy recovered fully running and shouting within a week as though nothing had happened, the way 3-year-olds recover from things that would break an adult. Fern Yardley's chest cold cleared with warmth and rest and did not become pneumonia. The infant born 7 weeks before the storm gained weight during the shelter period because its mother, warm and fed, was able to nurse without difficulty. When the county roads were finally passable by wagon, Dr. Silas Hargrave rode up from his practice 40 miles south to check on the families in the area. He was a methodical man, thin and precise, who kept careful records and did not exaggerate. He examined the Calloway boy and found no lasting damage. He listened to Fern Yardley's lungs and pronounced them clear. He weighed the infant and noted a healthy gain. He found no cold injuries among any of the people who had sheltered with Winifred. At other farms farther from Winifred's, his record showed a different story. 4 cases of frostbite, 2 of which resulted in the loss of toes. 1 case of severe pneumonia in a child that would leave scarring in the lungs for years. Hargrave drove out to Winifred's farm on a cold February afternoon and asked to see the structure. Winifred took him down. He walked the length of the chamber, examined the walls, the roof, the stove, placement, the storage room. He placed his hand flat against the wall and held it there for 10 seconds, feeling the temperature. He checked the stovepipe seal. He noted the dimensions in his notebook. Then he turned to Winifred and said, "Mrs. Moorfield, I have practiced medicine for 18 years. This saved more lives than anything in my bag." Winifred offered him coffee. He accepted. They sat in the chamber and drank it, and neither of them said anything more because there was nothing more to say. The structure spoke for itself. It had spoken for 61 hours and 31 people had heard it. In February, Prentice Whitmore heard about the shelter. He heard about it the way men in small towns hear about things that challenge everything they assume through second-hand accounts that arrive with the force of gossip and the weight of fact. He heard that a woman he had offered $260 to walk away had instead built a structure that kept 31 people alive during the worst storm anyone could remember. He heard that the structure used principles of construction that no one in the territory had ever seen. He heard that the woman had done it alone with a spade and a wheelbarrow and a $4 stove while he sat in his office writing letters about how she would not last. He did not come back to the farm. He did not write. But Winifred heard through Anson Yardley that Whitmore had told someone in Huron, "That land isn't for sale anymore. The whole county won't let her sell it even if she wanted to." It was the last time Winifred ever heard his name, and when Anson told her, she laughed. It was a small laugh, quiet, almost private, but it was real, and it was the first time she had laughed since Lawson died, and the sound of it surprised her more than anyone. A correspondent from the Huron Daily Plainsman rode out to the farm that same month and wrote a short piece about what he called a remarkable sod shelter constructed by a local widow. The piece ran on page 3 and was picked up by 2 other territorial papers. It described the dimensions and construction method in enough detail that several families in the region built similar structures the following autumn. Most of them succeeded well enough. None of them built it quite the way Winifred had, because none of them carried Dagny Chenoweth's knowledge in their memory, but the principle was sound enough to survive imperfect execution, which is the mark of a truly great idea. It does not require genius to replicate. It only requires someone willing to dig. Winifred Moorfield remained on her claim. She did not sell. She did not go east. The first spring after the blizzard was the hardest she had ever worked, and she had worked hard every spring since arriving in the territory. The plow needed new handles. The well pump had frozen and cracked during the storm and required 2 days of work with Lawson's tools to repair work that Winifred had watched him do, but had never done herself, and she cut her thumb badly on the second morning and wrapped it in a strip of petticoat and kept going because the wheat needed to go in, and the wheat did not care about her thumb. Anson Yardley came by in March with Jasper. They did not come to advise. They came to help. They spent 3 days repairing the fence line on the north boundary that Lawson had been fixing when he first coughed a year ago, and they did it without being asked, without negotiation, without any conversation about payment. On the 3rd day as they were leaving, Anson stopped at the gate and turned back. "Mrs. Moorfield," he said, and then he stopped because what he wanted to say was not easy for a man like Anson Yardley to say, a man who had spent his whole life believing that he understood how the world worked and who had learned in the space of one winter that he did not. If you need anything this spring, anything at all, you come to us. Winifred thanked him. She meant it. Vivian came too, not with her family, but alone on a Saturday in April when the snow had melted and the first green shoots of prairie grass were pushing through the mud. She brought a word of preserved plums and a packet of seeds tomato and squash, and she stayed for 2 hours helping Winifred turn the kitchen garden behind the house. They worked side by side without speaking much the way people work, who have already said the important things and are now simply doing what comes next. When Vivian left, she squeezed Winifred's hand once at the gate and walked home, and Winifred stood watching her cross the field and thought, that girl will be fine. That girl was paying attention all along. She planted winter wheat in the autumn of 1887 and hired a neighbor's son for the harvest, paying him in flour and potatoes and a share of the crop, and the crop came in strong because the land was good land, as Lawson had always said. And Lawson had been right about the land, the same way Dagny had been right about the earth. The harvest brought in enough to pay the mortgage, replenish her stores, and set aside $12 in cash for the first time since Lawson died. $12 was not wealth, it was not security, but it was proof that the land could sustain a woman and 2 children if that woman was willing to work it properly, and Winifred was willing, and the land responded the way land always responds to people who take it seriously, with patience, with difficulty, and eventually with abundance. In 1889, when the Dakota Territory became the states of North and South Dakota, Winifred was listed in the county land records as a property owner in good standing. Her mortgage was paid off. Her acreage was intact. She was 32 years old. Her daughters grew up on that land. Astrid married a farmer from 2 counties north and had 4 children, and she taught every one of them what the ground could do, not as a lecture, but as a fact of life, the way you teach a child to swim or to read the sky for weather. Corinne became a school teacher and moved to Rapid City, where she lived quietly and usefully until 1951. And the students who knew her best said she had a way of listening that made you feel like what you were saying mattered, a quality she had learned from her mother, who had learned it from Dagny, who had learned it from the earth. The underground chamber stood for 12 years after the blizzard. Winifred used it as a root cellar and cold storage space, and during 2 subsequent severe winters in 1893 and 1897, it served as an emergency shelter again. But by then, the community had learned enough that no one needed to be carried to it. They came on their own. They walked through the snow and ducked through the entrance tunnel and sat by the stove and waited for the storm to pass, and they did it without embarrassment and without apology, because they had learned something that cannot be taught by advice or argument, but only by experience, that the person who looks foolish today may be the person who saves your life tomorrow. In 1893, Jasper Yardley, then 23 years old, dug an underground shelter on his own property. It was not as well built as Winifred's. The walls were rougher. The entrance angle was slightly off, the stovepipe leaked a little in heavy wind. But it worked. It held through 2 bad storms and kept his young family warm when the temperature dropped below the level that frame houses could handle. When people asked him where he had learned to build it, he said without hesitation and without irony, "From the woman I once thought was crazy." In 1899, Winifred had the entrance tunnel extended and a proper wooden door installed. The hinge was wrought iron, heavy and smooth, the kind of hardware Lawson would have chosen. She ordered it from a catalog in Huron and hung it herself. And she planted climbing roses over the sod roof. Red roses, the old-fashioned kind, the kind that bloom heavy and fragrant in June and fill the air with a sweetness so strong you can smell it from the road. The roses sent their roots down through the sod and into the earth beneath, drawing water from the same ground that had held warmth for 31 people during the worst storm in memory, and they bloomed every June for as long as Winifred lived on the farm, which was a very long time. She never spoke publicly about what Dagny had taught her. She never wrote it down. She never gave interviews beyond the single paragraph in The Plainsman. She had not built the shelter to prove anything or to make a point or to show anyone that she was right. She had built it because she remembered, and because remembering was the only thing she had that was worth more than Prentice Whitmore's $260, worth more than a train ticket to Wisconsin, worth more than the collective well-meaning, utterly wrong advice of every neighbor and pastor and speculator who had looked at her and seen a woman who was finished. She was not finished. She had barely started. The knowledge did not die with Winifred. It passed to Astrid, who passed pieces of it to her children, who carried it the way families carry things that save their people. Not as doctrine, not as instruction, but as instinct. As a quiet pull felt most strongly in moments of uncertainty, a pull that says, when everyone around you is building upward, when everyone is stacking their faith in walls and roofs and the things that stand above the storm, it might be worth stopping for a moment and looking down at the ground beneath your feet, at what is already there, already waiting, already holding its warmth in the silence and the dark, patient and steady and older than memory. Because the earth does not forget what it knows. And on a farm 12 miles east of Huron, in what was once the Dakota Territory and is now the state of South Dakota, there is a low mound in a field where the grass grows thick and wild. The entrance tunnel collapsed decades ago. The sod roof settled and sank and became part of the land again. The stovepipe rusted and fell. But in June, if you walk out to that spot at the right time of day, when the light comes in low from the west and the wind moves through the tall grass, the way it has always moved, you will find roses. Red roses growing in a perfect rectangle, 22 feet by 14 feet, blooming where a woman once dug a hole in the ground because her grandmother told her the earth would keep her alive, and the earth did, and the roses remember, and they bloom every year as proof that the thing a boy once called a grave was never a grave at all. It was a promise, kept by the ground, honored by the woman who trusted it, and neither of them ever broke their word.